Hi, you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. This is Gary Zacharias. I would like to take a third look at a book by Richard Abanes. I think that's the way to pronounce it, Abanes. It's called One Nation Under Gods, A History of the Mormon Church. And this is a real eye-opener because we have Mormon neighbors, and they're the greatest people in the world. I'm so glad they're our neighbors. And you see what the Mormons do as far as helping each other out when there are financial problems. They help get each other jobs. They have family evenings together. Just really wonderful people. But that's not the focus. The focus is, so what's your organization? What's the background of the organization? I think I've mentioned this before, but somebody said, when you're dealing with a group that's not an Orthodox Christian group, you should be asking three questions. One is, what's the foundational organization behind your group? What's their history? Secondly, and why should we trust it? And then secondly, who do you say Jesus is? And third, how do you get saved? Right? So if you talk to Mormons and they sound like sweet people, and they are, you can ask those three questions, and all of a sudden different things start coming out. So I have done a couple of podcasts from this book in the past. One was on problems with the Book of Mormon itself. One was the question, is Mormonism Christianity? So this one is really good. By the way, on the back here, the great-great-grandchild of Brigham Young is named Sandra Tanner, and she runs a ministry trying to talk to Mormons about their faith and why they ought to think about at least switching over to traditional Christianity. Here's what she has to say. One Nation Under Gods is a well-written and absorbing book that's ideal for anyone wanting a concise, accurate, and easy-to-understand history of Mormonism from its inception to the present. Hank Hanegraaff, who's CRI president, that's Christian Research Institute, called it a unique and fascinating book. Documents many of the rarely discussed aspects of Mormon history known only to serious investigators of Mormonism's past. All right, so let's pick up chapter 16, titled Mormon Racism, Black is Not Beautiful. Here's what Joseph Smith Jr. in 1843 had to say. Now, he's the founder of the Mormon Church. Had I anything to do with the Negro, I would confine them by strict law to their own species. Okay, so that's how they start the chapter off. So they start off by saying in 1960, Mormons had become assimilated into American society. They weren't seen as peculiar anymore. People saw them as patriotic and conservative and very moral people. Their membership around 1960, about almost 2 million people. Temples are being built all over the place. They are gaining converts right and left. And the church had access to all sorts of great media tools that would influence people, television and radio. Their tabernacle choir had been broadcasting, and they had worldwide tours for the musical group. And then in 1959, that choir actually won a Grammy for the Ballad Hymn of the Republic. Seems very, very American. At the same time, Bain says that the Mormon Church was enjoying all sorts of economic prosperity and growing as much as any U.S. corporation. It had all sorts of real estate. It had media outlets. It had 300,000 shares of stock in the Times Mirror Corporation, 80,000 acres of Canadian land in Alberta, 220,000 acres of land in Florida. It was receiving financial contributions from its members, something like $100 million annually. Well, polygamy was no longer an issue. That wasn't a big deal. That had died out in 1945 when the LDS president died, Heber Grant. He was a one-time polygamist. But in the 1960s, another issue affected the LDS general authorities, and that was Mormon racism. And Bain says it was allowed to flourish unchallenged in the 19th and into the 20th centuries, but finally, because of the American Civil Rights Movement, this aspect of Mormonism faced a lot of opposition. So it said, if you really know the Latter-day Saint beliefs, Mormonism and racism are synonymous. Mormonism, of course, obscures that in recent decades. Today's Mormons try to portray past racist statements as nothing but just, oh, that was personal opinion. Those are just trivial expressions. They allowed black males in the LDS Church in 1978 to have access to Mormonism's priesthood. But they said that doesn't really erase the previous 148 years of Mormon racist and white supremacist teachings. Why? And that all directly related, not just because there are a few people that had bad ideas about African Americans, but it had to do with this LDS doctrine called pre-existence. Okay, so what's Baines talking about there? Well, that's traditional and LDS belief that everyone's place in the world, in other words, what country you are born into, what socioeconomic status you have, all of that is determined by your conduct in the pre-mortal world. And that's from the book of Abraham. That's from Joseph Smith's book. Speaks of the noble and great ones who lived in the pre-existent realm as God's spirit children. So these spirits served God well. They did the things God wanted, and they did good things, and finally they were allowed to come to earth. And as a result, they were rewarded by being born into great circumstances. For example, they might be born in a Caucasian country or born in America as a Mormon. So these righteous spirits had all sorts of advantages. But less commendable spirits, in other words, ones that hadn't done such a great job before they were born, they came into this world with fewer advantages. It depended on how they performed in that pre-earth world. And here it is. They were born as non-white. So their punishment for not having been as good as they could have been in the pre-existence was coming into this world with dark skin. So not only your race, but the darkness of skin within the race played a big deal, right? Their idea was the darker the race and the skin, the less righteous that spirit had behaved before the premortal life. And there's an apostle that explained that in 1954 at a BYU lecture. He said, "We cannot escape the conclusion that because of performance in our preexistence, some of us are born as Chinese, some as Japanese, some as Latter-day Saints. These are rewards and punishments. A Chinese born in China with a dark skin and with all the handicaps of that race seems to have little opportunity." And he goes on, says, of all the races and skin tones represented on earth, what was the worst, according to LDS teaching? Black. That dark skin. The idea was that's not an honorable person. That's amazing. There was, again, a Latter-day Saint, John Stewart, in the 1960s. He was billed as one of the most widely read Mormon authors. Now, he explained that the behavior of these pre-existent spirits was so bad they were born into filth, poverty, and degradation, like ghettos or third world countries. He said they ended up penalizing themselves. The 10th LDS president, Joseph Fielding Smith, said something kind of like that in his book, Doctrines of Salvation. Here's what he had to say. "There's a reason why one man is born black and with other disadvantages, while another is born white with great advantages. The reason is we once had an estate before we came here and were obedient, more or less, to the laws that were given us there. Those who were faithful in all things there received greater blessings here, and those who were not faithful received less." So a person's skin color, more than anything else, was looked upon as what happened during a great rebellion in that pre-existent realm thousands or maybe millions of years ago. And this was a cosmic war between Lucifer and Christ, and that affected everyone. Those who fought with Christ, are you surprised about this? They were born as privileged Mormon whites. If those were not valiant or maybe even kind of sidled up to Lucifer, they were born black. They were born through the lineage of Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, the one who murdered his brother. Cain was cursed with a dark skin, said LDS Apostle Bruce McConkie. He became the father of the Negroes. Brigham Young said something like that. So prior to 1978, LDS people additionally felt or believed that the greatest consequences of being substandard in your premortal performance, you lost the right to the Mormon priesthood. Joseph Fielding Smith said blacks couldn't hold the priesthood. Why? They were an inferior race cursed with black skin. So, most unfortunate for blacks was the loss of the priesthood blessings, which meant that unless they changed their policy, and they did eventually, no black could participate in those temple rites that were so necessary for you to get the blessings of the celestial kingdom. It's called the exaltation. Well, since priesthood membership has always been a prerequisite for holding any kind of LDS church office, do you see what's happening here? Blacks were barred from the Mormon hierarchy. So blacks, prior to 1978, they couldn't hold the priesthood. They couldn't hold any high church office. So what could they look forward to as Mormons? Well, it says, if the Negro is faithful all his days, this is a quote from another high-up Mormon, he can enter the celestial kingdom. He'll go there as a servant. Well, that was pretty controversial. It said the Mormons tried to keep that idea quiet. They said it was discussed among longtime members and LDS leaders, but you didn't want to share it with potential converts, unbelievers, or Mormon critics. There was an Apostle Peterson. He tried to suppress from public release the lecture in which he made that previous statement. In 1966, Bruce McConkie, now he was an apostle, so he was high up, agreed with this teaching. He wrote something called Mormon Doctrine. He said the Negroes are not equal with other races where the receipt of certain spiritual blessings are concerned. So what happened? Well, a lot of saints in the 1960s, the LDS people, concluded that segregation of the races, now that was a really big deal during the Civil Rights Movement, right? The attack on segregation, rightly so. But many LDS saints believed that segregation was ordained by God. And of course, that segregation included a prohibition on interracial marriage. That's considered just an awful deed for the Mormon belief system. Now, despite, Baines goes on, despite evidence to the contrary, he said, Mormons have consistently argued that that's not racist. That seems odd, doesn't it? Because, of course, it is racist. What else are you going to call it? Here's somebody who's a Mormon. There's a book called The Glory of Mormonism, argued that suffering due to racism was God's fault, not anybody else's. And here's a quote. When God allows a spirit to take on a Negroid body, do you suppose he's unaware of the fact that he will suffer a social stigma? Therefore, if you say this church is unjust in not allowing the Negro to bear the priesthood, you must, to be consistent, likewise say that God is even more unjust in giving him a black skin. Ooh. Now, remember what we said about the intermarriage of blacks and whites. Brigham Young said, shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. This will always be so. In a 1947 letter, the LDS First Presidency adamantly condemned any thought of interracial marriage. Here's a quote from that 1947 letter. Your ideas, as we understand them, appear to contemplate the intermarriage of the Negro and white races, a concept which has heretofore been most repugnant to most normal-minded people from the ancient patriarchs until now. So prior to 1978, they said there was a lot of strong language used by LDS leaders to believe that even if you had one drop of Negro blood, that would disqualify a person from holding the priesthood. Apostle Peterson again, he said, if there's one drop of Negro blood in my children, as I have read to you, they receive the curse. He also said to his white audience, you got to avoid marrying blacks. Anybody. You got to avoid marrying anybody who's dark-skinned, maybe a Hawaiian, a Japanese, or Chinese. Official LDS publications also presented highly racist mischaracterizations of blacks. There was a Mormon church doctrine, or an article called Juvenile Instructor. It alleged that blacks had the lowest intelligence of all humans, were the most barbarous of all people, advanced slower than anyone else, and the least capable of improvement. That same article described blacks as looking like someone or something had been overcooked. Really? This came out in 1947. Here's what it said. A Negro looks as though he's been put in an oven and burnt to a cinder. His hair baked crisp, his nose melted to his face, and the color of his eyes runs into the whites. Some men look as if they've only been burned brown, but he appears to have gone a stage farther. and been cooked until he was quite black. Can you imagine hearing people talk like that today? It says even through the early 1970s, Mormon leaders continued to promote a lot of really anti-black rhetoric and had these offensive stereotypes and pushed for segregationist policies. But the church leaders looked around and they realized what was happening. Mormons' expansion outside the U.S. was not going well because of their view of blacks. And you had the civil rights movement here in this country, and it made Mormonism look pretty bad. They were starting to find protests occurring against the church, like the NAACP. They were targeting the church as a hotbed of ongoing racism. In 1966, there was a man named Wallace Turner. He wrote a book called The Mormon Establishment. And he said the most serious problem facing the LDS church today is the Negro question. Even as he wrote these words, though, events were taking place coming up to a 1978 policy change concerning blacks in the priesthood. And in 1951, they said even in 51, a new man took over as LDS president. His name was David McKay, and he was different than the earlier general authorities. He was free of traditional notions about curses and things like that. So the civil rights movement was putting a lot of pressure on this McKay, especially on a man named Steve Holbrook. He was a young Mormon, and he had been involved with this church. He disagreed with their idea. He worked with the NAACP. They had several demonstrations in Utah against the racist views. And so all of a sudden there's some things happening there that are beginning to change how they view the blacks. Mormon leaders, high-ranked Mormon leaders, Ezra Taft Benson, by the way, I think he was in the Eisenhower administration, Harold Lee, and Joseph Fielding Smith all became Mormon presidents after McKay died in 1970. Benson was a fanatical anti-communist and promoted the ultra-conservative John Birch Society. He was probably the leading bigot of the group. He condemned the 1965 civil rights demonstration in Utah. He said the communists were using it. And his son, Reed Benson, went several steps further. He publicly endorsed the founder of the John Birch Society. His name was Robert Welch. Welch had accused U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower of being a communist agent. Wow. Reed, he was a member of the Birch Society. He hatched a destructive plan to spread anti-black hysteria throughout Utah using the Birch organization. What he was going to do, he's going to spread false stories about violent African-American demonstrations. And that's what he sent out there. Well, it says then in 1966, people tried to get Benson elected as U.S. president, and that's Ezra Taft Benson. For a running mate, they chose South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, who was violently opposed to voting rights and all, but he didn't get enough party support, so Benson didn't make it. After the death of McKay, then, you have Joseph Fielding Smith. He became the Mormons' prophetic mantle. He only lasted 2 years, then Harold Lee took over. He died another year, and then you had Spencer Kimball, and he wanted Mormonism to really spread. So we're talking about the 1970s. And he seemed to understand better than these earlier individuals that if Mormonism was going to expand, it had to change its policies on blacks. And so the Mormon church started making some concessions. They allowed some blacks to join the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. They allowed black Boy Scouts to be patrol leaders. And some blacks are actually admitted to Brigham Young University. And then Kimball wanted to build a new temple in Brazil in 1974. Well, the only people that could enter that were priesthood holders. So what are you going to do? You don't have any blacks involved? And so it said on June 9th, 1978, Kimball released a document to the media announcing that blacks now could be granted LDS priesthood. So how is that change seen? I mean, how did they push that? Did they just say, oh, we changed our mind? No, they said that was a revelation from God. It says Mormons were pleased God had changed his mind. It was very convenient at that time, of course, to take the pressure off them. So that was 1978, that brought a radical shift. It says, few saints left the church or criticized Kimball's revelation. Now, that contradicted immediately with all the statements of the past LDS leaders. Brigham Young, how big was he in the church? He said blacks would not receive the priesthood until after the resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. So, pretty sad. Kimball, in 1978, he said this change was a fulfillment of the promises made by the prophets and presidents of the church who have preceded us. What? No, that comment was simply false. The 1978 revelation was not a fulfillment of these promises. It was a contradiction of the promises made by past LDS prophets and presidents. Isn't that amazing? Oh, it's a fulfillment that changed. No, that's one thing you can take away from this podcast today. One person said, what that revelation doesn't say is we're no longer of the lineage of Cain, that we no longer did these things in pre-existence. It does not say we are not cursed with black skin. So I said, if you look at this, and this is at the end of the chapter, several questions have never really been adequately answered by Mormons. So these are good questions you might, if you really get deep into this with a Mormon, you might talk about. Number one, if God has removed the curse that at one time kept blacks from the priesthood, then why hasn't he removed the marks of that curse, like a flat nose and black skin, as Brigham Young said? Number two, if some spirits continue to be cursed with black skin because they were unrighteous in the premortal world, why does that same unrighteous behavior now no longer disqualify them from the priesthood? Number three, if black skin is no longer a sign of a special curse, then does that mean white skin is no longer a sign of special blessing? Yeah, that's really interesting. Sandra Tanner, remember I mentioned her at the beginning? She's praised this book. She has a book called Mormonism, Shadow or Reality. She says, by this new revelation, without explaining it, Mormon leaders are leaving their people in a dense doctrinal fog. And then they end the chapter, Baines ends the chapter by talking about the current LDS president, Gordon Hinckley, and I think he's passed away since the book was written. But says he seems determined to do away with any doubts among the general public about whether Mormonism qualifies as a denomination of Christianity. It says, despite his efforts, though, Mormon critics continue to insist that basically Mormonism is at best a non-Christian faith and at worst little more than a religious cult. So there's a chapter dealing with the racism of the church. Now, of course, has there been racism in traditional Christianity? Yes, that's just really unfortunate, but it's not the leaders, the foundational leaders, who said that. I mean, you get some branches that do that kind of stuff, but it hasn't been the foundational belief system, especially this premortal existence business. Well, I hope you found this to be interesting, and I hope your day is going well, and we'll do another podcast soon. Thanks for being part of this.